Stephanie,
Hi, David.
how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So welcome everybody to the fourth episode of EDU Live. Excited to be here. I have a cicada symphony going on behind me, so hopefully nobody will hear that picked up in my microphone, but I literally stepped outside and it was like, so for those of you who live in the DC area, you'll know what I mean. But really thrilled to continue to be able to have these great conversations. For those of you who have tuned in the past, as you know, EDU Live is a monthly conversation series that I get to have with really thoughtful folks in higher ed and in this case at Gallup, who care a lot about issues of equity, access, and opportunity in higher ed. And I'm really looking forward to this week's conversation. I've had a chance to work closely with Stephanie over the last couple of years, and I feel like every time that I talk to her, whether it's in the context of some of the work that we're doing with Gallup or just more generally, she's always a wealth of knowledge and insights in light of what she gets to do every day for her job. So what I encourage everybody for this episode is, definitely take advantage of Stephanie being with us and put your questions in the chat, because we're going to spend a little bit more time, hopefully getting to those questions, because as I said, she's really a unique resource and knowledge base when it comes to all of these issues. So I think everybody also knows that I always like to start with a little bit of background on who our guests are. And so with that, Stephanie, tell me a little bit about, where you grew up, how you found yourself coming to Washington, and what led you to Gallup.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for having me and for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. I've tuned into the others, and they're always amazing conversations. So excited to be a part of them. What led me to Gallup? So I'm actually from originally Nantucket, Massachusetts. Every time I say that, people are like, oh, people really live there year round. People do live there year round. Really funny place if you've never been. It's a small island off the coast of Massachusetts. And grew up there, went to Nantucket High School, only one high school if you are from Nantucket that you go to, graduated with 84 kids. And I ended up at Elon, which is an important part of how I ended up at Gallup, because when I was at Elon University during my undergraduate experience, I actually interned in a polling center. And I just fell in love with public opinion polling. I thought it was amazing what people would say to you over the telephone as an interviewer. People really say the darndest things. And I think sometimes people don't realize that. They assume that people filter themselves in an interview like that. Not the case. People are their very candid selves. So I just really fell in love with that notion, right? That people would share their thoughts with a stranger in that capacity, and you could really provide people a voice in that way. So while I was interning, I had an amazing advisor and mentor, a gentleman named Hunter Bacow, who was a professor at Elon. He said, you should really think about doing this long term. There were some great graduate programs in this. I ended up at UConn's graduate program in survey research. And then, of course, the first day in any survey research program, people will say Gallup is mentioned at least once, right? So it was a real dream for me to come to Gallup, an organization that was really founded on the mission of helping people be heard, because that was so core to what I wanted to do. In terms of education, I've always been a big believer that education is not just on, a tool to really level the playing field, but kind of our only tool, honestly, to level the playing field. I think of it as really our only equalizer that we have. I grew up, money was incredibly tight, but my mom really made it clear that that would not be a barrier for me to go on to achieve a degree at an institution that I wanted. In part, I think it was because she didn't have that experience herself, right? So she grew up one of 9. Her mother actually didn't even believe in college for young girls. So she actually forged her signature on a college application because my grandmother refused to sign the application for her. She went on to go through 2 years at an institution, but just couldn't afford to stay. And I think it was just really important to her that I didn't have that experience, that I had that opportunity to actually complete my degree. And so I think that had a huge impression how I thought about education long-term, and why I was so excited to focus specifically on education research at Gallup, because I just really think it's our only tool to kind of address some of the inherent inequities that exist within our society. So it's a little bit about how I ended up in your Zoom room, I think.
There we go. I like that. And I assume you're going to be totally honest. And so I'm going to ask you a bunch of no, I'm kidding. So I guess my next question would be, what does it actually mean to run the education division at Gallup? Like, give me a sense of what kind of work you do, examples of the kinds of clients and partners that you do work with, and then we can dig into a little bit of the substance around what's happening in the world in higher ed.
Yeah, well, so I have the pleasure of working with our foundations, our agency partners, our institutional partners, even some of our K-12 school districts that partner with Gallup. So within my purview on a day-to-day basis, I'm really blessed with a really diverse group of organizations that we work with here at Gallup. Anybody who's really focused on improving student outcomes and really improving the quality of the faculty and staff experience too for those individuals who serve those students. That's really within my purview. So we have clients as diverse in mission as you can imagine, an organization, folks like 2U, individual institutions like Western Governors University, Simmons University. So we're really blessed with a really diverse group of folks that are really focused on the mission of education, whether it be at the K-12 and the higher education level, and how we address some of the inherent inequities and what students are experiencing within those institutions and within those schools. So that's really our focus at Gallup, is kind of quantifying the issues that schools are facing and that their students are facing, and trying to help them develop strategies to address some of those inherent challenges, and allowing them to compare themselves to other institutions and other student populations nationally, because we do have some of these very large benchmarks for which we understand outcomes look like nationally. So we're able to work with an individual school and say, maybe 55% of your students say that they would recommend this school to another friend or family member. Maybe you think it should be 100, but what you don't know is only 20% of students might say that nationally. So we try to give them a little bit of a sense of some of their unique strengths and opportunities for improvement in how they serve their students.
Great, very helpful. So, one thing I did in preparation for this conversation is I went to, the Gallup website and looked at the higher education section and noticed just the nature of the headlines of the kind of research that you're doing. So beyond the research that you recently did with us, which we'll talk a little bit about later, about, can higher ed provide equitable experience? You do have things like why higher education should lead the well-being revolution, are college grads prepared for the workforce, crisis and confidence in higher education. So I guess talk a little bit, obviously the last year in particular has been, just unprecedented for us all. But, the overnight pivot to virtual for higher ed was, pretty profound on a variety of levels. I guess I want to start by asking you, before COVID hit, if someone had asked you this question about how should we be thinking about fostering greater access and opportunity and equity in higher ed, what are the kind of questions and what are the kinds of kind of top of mind insights and perspectives do you think, like how would that conversation have been framed, 18 months, 24 months ago?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest changes in the conversations that we've had has been around this issue of well-being. So for those of you who are less familiar with some of our work here at Gallup, we've been studying and measure well-being really for decades now as an organization. We've been really obsessed with it. And within our alumni survey work, we've been measuring well-being among college graduates to help schools understand a little bit more about the extent to which their graduates are achieving what we would call a great life upon graduation and how they can help in that process. And in that process, one thing that we found is there was a lot of reluctance, I would say, before the pandemic to talk about well-being. We always encouraged clients to actually measure well-being among their graduates and also measure well-being among their currently enrolled student population and even their faculty and staff. And in the case of faculty and staff, what we often heard was, well, their well-being is personal and this is a professional survey, and maybe we don't need to know how they're doing in their personal life as it relates to their work. I think what COVID reminded us all of is actually their personal is impacting their professional, because now the two are one really, and they're not leaving their homes on a day-to-day basis. So I think there was this understanding now in a way that we didn't experience prior to COVID, that what's happening for people personally is actually going to have a huge impact on how they show up for work. So what I've been encouraged by, I think, is that conversation we were trying to have prior to the pandemic and trying to steer towards people towards, that they were maybe a little reluctant about, they've really taken to, right? So there's been this intense focus on measuring well-being over the last 18 months in a way we've never seen before. And that's also been true for currently enrolled students, because so much of students' ability to be present within their schoolwork is how they are functioning in their personal life, right? If they're really stressed about their financial well-being because they can't manage their financial stress, they're not going to be really present in a Zoom room to have an engaging conversation about racial inequities in the United States. They just can't physically process that conversation. At the same time, they've got these other stressors in their lives. So I think there's been a little bit of a reckoning about how important well-being has been. That's a conversation we were trying to have prior to the pandemic with a lot of institutions and organizations, and one now that we find they're coming to us for and asking advice about. So that's, I think, really exciting. That's one of the major shifts I've seen in the conversation that COVID has brought about.
And then, an obvious thing that we'd want to ask about is, obviously, 2U has been around now for 13 years, and there's plenty of players in the online space. And, it does feel, at least from where I sit, that the conversation around online now has started to change from what it was before COVID. But interestingly, you could argue that, a lot of those foundational elements of what was already happening in online were happening before COVID. So maybe share a little bit of both your personal perspective, but also, what you're seeing and hearing in the research that you do, whether it's with Strata or other entities, around perceptions of online, the value proposition. Are there differences in demographic groups around the value or, appeal of online versus on ground?
Yeah, we've been tracking the appeal or perceived quality that people think that they'll receive from an online education for more than a decade now here at Gallup from our larger education practice. And what we've seen consistently is that a larger proportion of people are considering or actually preferring an online modality. And you see this in other research that Strata Education Network has conducted and some others have done over the last 6 months, where you see a clear preference actually for online modalities, particularly among adult learners who maybe can't afford to relocate to a really expensive city like Washington, D.C. or Boston, but want the GW or the Simmons University experience, right? They want that quality, high quality education, but they can't physically relocate to get it, particularly for people who have families or are working while continuing getting their degree, whether it be at the undergraduate or the graduate level. So we see actually a strong preference for online. I think what we've realized over the last year is, and this should have been obvious prior to the pandemic, but not all online experiences are created equal, just like not all in-person experiences are created equal. I mean, we've always known that about in-person experiences, right? That, no two institutions are alike in terms of what they provide, and that there's a lot of variation across colleges, and particularly for certain subgroups of those student populations. But I think there's been this perception that online programs are monolithic, and in reality, they're not. They're incredibly varied in how they are structured and the types of students they're structured to serve. I mean, some are not structured to serve adult learners, even though adult learners are overwhelmingly choosing an online program. They're structured much more effectively to serve traditional age students. And the opposite's true, right? We hear from a lot of online institutions that were actually overwhelmed during the pandemic at the number of traditional age students that were applying. And they felt like they were actually better designed to serve adult learners. And they said, this is not a population we've captured before. And we don't have the same dynamic campus-based experience online that a student would be expecting if they were choosing between us and an in-person experience. Right. So I think, there's been this awareness that not all online programs are created equal. And that also importantly, the extent to which you do well in an online program is not based on it being online or in person, right? That modality is not the predictor of success. The predictor is the extent to which it's been intentionally designed to be delivered online. And we saw that in the research that we conducted with 2U. We've seen in research we've conducted with other institutions internally to their school, where you see that for institutions that had a lot of practice prior to the pandemic and had really been thoughtful about how they were designing their curriculum, they had a pretty seamless process last year. I mean, in fact, we saw quality ratings among schools who had an online presence prior to the pandemic. Quality ratings actually improved for some of them among students who actually pivoted from in-person to online. So it wasn't all bad news. If you had a lot of experience with online education prior to the pandemic, you actually fared pretty well and retained students at a really high rate. It was the schools that assumed online was a Zoom room that I think really failed, right? That they just threw up a Zoom link. And it was incredibly taxing on faculty and staff, incredibly frustrating for students. And students just felt really disassociated from one another. I mean, I think that's been the real challenge, right? This disconnect, this lack of connection between students and faculty. I will say one of the most encouraging findings we found during the pandemic was with an individual school where we were tracking the relationship between faculty and students. And what we found for that institution, which did have a huge online presence prior to the pandemic, but did migrate students from in-person to online, we actually found that their faculty ratings improved during the pandemic. Students were actually rating the faculty even higher than they had prior to COVID-19. And I think it's because they recognized the work that faculty had done to adjust and to pivot to an online modality. And I think it's because those faculty had been trained, right? Simply put, we had been in an online setting before, and if you've never taught online, it's really challenging the first time, right? There are things you would do in an online environment you would never do in person and vice versa. So I think knowing that the faculty to student experience actually improved for some schools, it's a good reminder that just because you're online doesn't mean that it's not going to be a strong relationship. It could even be stronger in some cases, but it does require a lot of design consideration that I don't think every school was equipped to do. Although I certainly hope, my hope, of course, in the silver lining of COVID-19 is a lot of them realize, wow, this can be done. It can be done well, and it can be done in a way that's effective for students and captures more students. I mean, yeah. I think it has the opportunity to really improve on the access issue that you mentioned.
So let's dig in a little bit more there, just in terms of, I think your point about it has more to do with intentionality of design than it does with modality, and maybe dig in a little bit more on whether, and I'm not talking just in the context necessarily of the research that we've done with you, but just generally speaking, like what are the things that are the indicia of whether a student feels like they got the value out of the experience? One obvious one, which you touched on already, is, did you have a faculty member who you felt like was interested in your well-being and your success? But what are some of the other strong indicators? Because I think what we have seen in the work that we've done together is that if you do those things well, they actually do help create a more equitable experience. So we'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, you mentioned the one that's my favorite, which is the extent to which a student feels like their professors care about them as a person. And I think that's so important, right? Because what you don't want to be is just another, little square in someone's Zoom room. You want to feel like your unique challenges are really recognized. And I think that's at the heart of equity, right? So we talk about equity, not equality, very intentionally, because different students need different things. And, if you're a first generation college student, you probably need to talk to somebody a lot longer about which major you might select than if you're not, right? So I was a first generation college student. I was like every, first year student across the country. I was randomly assigned to this academic advisor who's in the history department. I had no intention of being a history student or history major. I went to him to change my designation and go from undeclared to actually declare as a business major. And this is no offense to any business majors out there. It's an amazing pathway, but as I was talking to him, I said, I'm going to declare as a business major. And he said, why? And he could have very simply just said, great, signed the form, and I would have been on my way. And honestly, he should have, because it would have saved him the next 20 minutes of his life and his day. And he wasn't going to be stuck with me long-term anyways. But he stopped me and he asked me why. And I said, well, I have to leave here with a plan. Like I have to leave here employable. I'm taking out a lot in student loans to be here. It's my family is sacrificing tremendously. Like it needs to be worth it in terms of what I return on my investment when I graduate. And he said, what are you passionate about? And I said, political science. He said, do that. Trust me, it will work itself out. Do not study something you're not passionate about and you don't love. And I thought that was, it's transformative advice for me, because had I not declared a political science major, I never would have been turned in the polling center. I never would have gone on to work at Gallup, and I never would have felt this fulfilled, I think, in a career. But it's a really simple example of like another 20 minutes that he spent with me because he was an engaged faculty member, because he cared tremendously, then really made me feel like I was cared for as a person, that like I mattered. I wasn't just somebody whose form was going to be signed and sent on my way. And those are like the examples of things that students describe right now are particularly transformative. So you think, for example, about an adult learner who might have childcare fall through and they just can't be on video, right? They have to be off video during their course time. Now, having a faculty who understands and will work with them and adapt, that makes a big difference. That makes somebody feel cared for as a person and not just like they're another student in the classroom. And I think that's the equity issue that we see in schools, that there's a lot of attempt to create centers or services that are expected to serve all students equally, when in reality, different students really need different things. So I think that's like one really important issue for higher education to address, is creating an equitable experience, not necessarily an equal experience among all students. And then some of the other things that I would say that are really simple is providing really high quality career resources in a remote environment, right? Not all students were on campus this last year, but they had the same need as every other graduating senior in terms of accessing really high quality career advice. And I think a lot about career advice, not just in which organization should you apply to, but more, how do you position yourself as a really competitive candidate to an employer? We talk a lot about that through strengths. So many tuning in might know us through our work in Clifton Strengths, where we provide assessments to individuals. We've had millions take those assessments, including hundreds of thousands of currently enrolled college students take them. And it helps you understand what you uniquely do well. And for a lot of students, they've only been told their entire academic life what they do wrong, right? That's kind of how our education system is set up. You find bad at and you try to fix it. When in reality, when you're talking to an employer, what you really want to be able to say is, I lead with learner. I want to constantly be learning and doing new things. And I'll bring that to your team by constantly researching new issues that your field is facing. Those kinds of descriptors make you a really desirable candidate to an employer, somebody who knows themselves and knows what they can uniquely offer that organization. So I think institutions who can find ways to help students in those conversations with potential employers, and also just allow them better access to alumni who might be in the field. I think a lot about platforms like Handshake and the ability to connect with an employer and apply directly to an employer. That has a huge impact for students. So career is more important, I would say, than ever. We see that in the work that we do with you all. We see that in the work we do with every institution that we work with. People are thinking about higher education as it relates to their pathway to a better job. That's just the reality. They want a better life too, by the way. So it's not just a better job, it's also a better quality of life, but they're there for a reason. It's usually career related. So they have to have access to those resources to actually connect to those jobs.
So let's spend a minute, a little bit on that sense of like career fulfillment. What does a positive career outcome actually entail? What I find interesting is seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between the public policy debate in the higher ed space, where there seems to be more and more focus on what is somebody's salary in their first job out of college as the benchmark of whether they had a rewarding or value added ROI on their higher education. And yet you talk to anybody in the business world and they will say, well, people are going to have to continue to learn their whole lives. So like what they're learning, what they've learned in college is helpful, but not, defining of their career path. And more importantly, like people are motivated by finding fulfillment in their career more than they are like just their salary. So it feels to me like those two things are a little bit disconnected. And I guess I'd just be interested in your perspective on like, is there a need to try and bring those conversations together in a more connected way?
Yeah, so, anybody who's read our reports will know that we believe that the non-economic value is just as important, if not in some cases even more important, than the economic value somebody derives from a degree. I'd be the first to say, obviously, employment rates and income, critically important, right? People go to higher education because they expect to be employed when they graduate, and they should have that expectation, and that's completely fair. But money doesn't equal happiness. And anybody who's read the World Happiness Report, any of the research that we put out there about that issue will know that I think one of the more famous findings we have at Gallup is that after about $75,000 in household income, you actually see no appreciable gains in well-being. And it's because money does not necessarily define the extent to which you view your life as a life well lived. And that's why when we started the Gallup alumni survey work, we had two key outcomes in mind. We had employee engagement in mind. We also had well-being in mind. And we believed, if the premise of a college education is that helps you achieve a greater job and a greater life, then somebody ought to be measuring that, not just employment rates, not just income, which are just a part of the greater puzzle on the issue of value. And that's why we ask one of my favorite questions that we ask in our surveys is, to what extent was your degree worth the cost? And it's worth the cost, not necessarily worth the tuition, because there are multiple types of costs that students are investing. It's the financial cost, it's the opportunity cost, it's time away from their family members, it's time out of the job market should they decide not to work while they're enrolled. And all of those things are important to their calculation. But I tend to believe that people who've actually experienced the issue, which is the 4-year experience, are the best arbiters on whether or not it was worth it. It's a little, I think, naive to think that we can look at their income alone and determine if it was a valuable experience. And that's just not how people conceptualize their life, right? Our research shows that it's not linked to income alone. So it'd be a silly, exercise, I think, to link it to just their income. So we need to have a much bigger conversation about value, and it needs to be encompassing of a lot of things, but it also has to be value to the individual. Some people go back to higher education because they want to switch careers. Some they want, you know, a higher paying job. Some they want a work that's more fulfilling. When we asked 2 years ago on the Gallup alumni survey, you know, how long did it take for you to get a good job? We also followed up and said, what made it a good job for 4-year degree holders? And we found purpose and pay were equally important to them. So if people are telling us that, then I think that they're the wisest to do so. I don't think it's on us to say, oh, you're a teacher and you make $72,000 a year and you went to a 4-year college that was, you know, 70,000 a year, and therefore your degree was not valuable, right? I think many of those teachers would disagree.
Real issue with that, right?
Yeah.
Yes, no doubt, no doubt. So let's pivot to some of the questions we've gotten from folks. So one of the questions is, obviously COVID's put a lot of pressure on institutions to, you know, retain students in these complicated times. Like, what are some of the resources that you've seen in your research that institutions should be offering or providing to students to, you know, better support them and ensure, you know, their needs as the pandemic continues and just kind of going forward?
Yeah. Well, I will say, I don't think some of the resources we've seen this year have been unique actually to COVID, which has been interesting. Like, some of the most powerful resources that I've seen have actually been things that schools have been doing, but maybe haven't been as available or as well known to students throughout the institution. So obviously emergency financial help has been incredibly important. And, you know, actual resources around food assistance has been really critical for a lot of students throughout the country, because it's one thing to pay tuition, it's another thing to actually meet living expenses, which is very challenging to finance for many different reasons, which is a whole nother conversation we could have. So I think that is critical. So emergency financial assistance, and I think it'll continue to be critical. I mean, yes, a lot of people have resumed work since the pandemic, but a lot of people haven't. And a lot of people have taken worse paying jobs and jobs that are really conflicting with their academic schedule for those who are working in a graduate or an undergraduate program while they study. So those things are not going away. So emergency financial assistance, I think, is so urgently needed across the US. And I would say, you know, some of the other supportive experiences that we've seen around conversations about racial inequities in the United States, you know, I've seen some really powerful and dynamic presidents really confront the issue by talking in a very direct way about what the institution is doing to address some of the inequities already existing within not just their school, but within higher education, and then outside of higher education, the communities in which they live. I think that that has been a really positive, you know, change in the last year, just the honesty in that conversation. So I think that will continue to be important. You know, a lot of students that we see who are attending an institution this year have reported that they're looking for inclusive schools to do so, right? Inclusivity is on the tops of minds of most incoming students this year. And I think for a good reason. They want a diverse and an inclusive experience. And I think higher education can deliver that, but it does require leadership be really committed to some of those principles. I mean, we see the value that provides a student when they graduate. One of my favorite findings from several years ago in our research was that if you reported that you had a really diverse experience at the undergraduate level, if you interacted with people who are different than you, whether it be their political beliefs or their racial and ethnic identity, their sexual orientation and gender identity, you're more likely to report that your degree is worth the cost. So it has an immediate benefit to the student that they see, not just in the short, but also the long term. So I would say, you know, the support that you can provide students in terms of making them feel welcome within your environment will continue to be really important this next year, and hopefully long after. I hope that's a change that really endures.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because you and I have talked in the past about the fact that I actually think on some of those dimensions, there are elements of online that actually can foster that in a easier way, in part because, to your point, like it, you know, I had this conversation maybe a month ago. You know, many people who've listened to the show know I'm a former trustee of my alma mater, Amherst, and you know, one of the conversations we were having is like, if you're a 42-year-old working adult, is Amherst really a place that you can go? Not really, right? And so that's another version of inclusion, right? Like in terms of the diverse experiences and I think it's what COVID has forced a lot of institutions to do is to really rethink, like, are we really well positioned to serve, like, not just the 18 to 22-year-old who wants to come here and have the physical campus experience, but somebody through that full spectrum of their career and life cycle who we want to keep a relationship with, but may need to deliver, different things to them, both in terms of the support services, but also like what kind of offerings they're looking for, whether they want a degree or a non-degree offering. So I think there's a lot of really interesting and exciting stuff to happen in that space. And, I feel like that will be one of the things that actually starts to change as a result of COVID. So one of the things that I think I told you as we were preparing that I wanted to ask you about is most of the time people come to you and say, hey, we would like to do research on X, Y, or Z. And they have, because either they have a perspective or they want to pressure test something that they have a theory of the case on. Like if somebody gave you, because you guys are not inexpensive, a large amount of money and said, Stephanie, you can do research on whatever you want to do research on, like, what would that be?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of some of the changes that are going to be coming with the new administration, and given the increased investment in community colleges and other credentials specifically. So there are two things I'd want to study. I mean, the first is around community colleges, because, I think what we know is that community colleges actually have the capacity to provide a tremendous amount of education throughout the US population. And they can do so in a way that other schools are not maybe equipped to do in terms of just sheer capacity. And yet we see in our research, and this was true in a recent report that we put forward with Carnegie Foundation, that a lot of parents are not thinking about a 2-year pathway for their students. So when you give them all options, when you say, if any pathway was available for your student, if money was no consequence, what would you want them to do? About half choose a bachelor's degree pathway. A very small proportion choose a 2-year, and a large proportion choose skill-based assessments, right? Skill-based activities and programming. So there's this preference for 4-year and skills-based programming, and they don't connect 2-year programs with some of the skills-based activities and program that we know they actually do include. So there's something about the 2-year experience that I don't know really is fundamentally resonating with parents as they think about where to steer their child. And I think that's important, because if we're going to continue to invest in 2-year institutions the way I think we will in the short term and long term, we also have to make sure that individual parents and households even know, what does a 2-year pathway look like? And how can it be even a pathway to a 4-year, right? It doesn't have to be a determining pathway. It can be something that's just the starting place for a student. So I'd be really curious if I could do research on this, on what are the blockers? I think I know what some of them might be in terms of the 2-year experience, but what are the blocks for individuals and why they don't even consider a 2-year community college for their graduating student? Because I think that would give us a lot of information about how could we get more students on that pathway and take advantage of some of the funding that we're making available. And then the other one, which you and I have talked about a lot, is the short-term credentials, right? I'm really curious about the outcomes from some of these short-term credentialing programs, because most of the outcomes-based research has combined unlike short-term credentials and kind of treated them as one coherent group. And that's not really truthful and transparent. And I think it's really unhelpful to education consumers who are considering what a credential program could look like, or a boot camp program like those that you offer. So I know we're going to probably do some of that research together. So I'm really excited.
That's exciting.
Yeah, that's something I really want to know, right? Is, what do the outcomes look like for those who participate in a boot camp or another short-term credential program, so we can inform consumers about what can they expect from those types of programs.
Yeah, so a question that came in, interesting. Do you see a role for universities in supporting alumni well-being after graduation? For instance, are you finding alumni demand for continuing education, reskilling, upskilling as they advance through the workforce and through life?
I do think there could be a role for universities. I think this is a place actually where universities haven't done as much as they could, right? So I think about some of the programs that have been launched where they bring alumni back on campus, and alumni participate in a series of courses because they're just lifelong learners and they love being back at their alma mater, and they just want to be with one another, and they want to be on campus, and they want to be nostalgic about that experience. I think that there's definitely a way to facilitate a stronger relationship with alumni once they graduate. I think the challenge is what we know about our research is if you don't create an emotionally attached student, they'll never be an emotionally attached alumni. So you do have to make that.
You got to get it right on the front end.
Yeah, it's like if you get it right on the front end, it'll pay dividends on the back end. But if they don't leave that institution feeling really positive about it, it's really hard to get them to connect back to the institution later. If they do leave emotionally attached, they'll be your greatest brand ambassadors. They donate to the institution, but they have to feel like when they were enrolled, they had a mentor who cared about them and helped them pursue their goals and dreams. They had an internship where they were able to apply what they were learning in a practical setting. They have to feel like they were cared for as a person. They have to have been engaged in extracurriculars. So you do have to get that front part right in order to even have a chance of reaching them once they graduate.
You know, it's interesting because the question is in some ways relevant to what the strategic thinking was recently, not to make this about us to you, but like of why we expanded our career engagement network, because what we found is that we saw a little bit of this in, you know, our research with you about, you know, people can have a great experience in school and then they get out into the workplace and there's additional complexities that they have to face. And, you know, so for those who are listening who aren't familiar with what I'm referring to, 2U recently announced that we are expanding the kind of career supports that would normally be offered only to students in our boot camps, which are very, you know, career focused. I'm looking for a job after the boot camp, to, you know, students who are both enrolled in and are alumni from both our degree granting programs as well as our short courses. And the theory being we have literally hundreds of employers that are actively recruiting out of our boot camps, but could also be recruiting graduates from our MBA programs or our social work programs and the like. And, you know, I think what we think is part of the challenge is there's some also, it's expensive. There's scale efficiency challenges with that. And it's hard for an individual institution to cultivate enough employer relationships to deliver the kind of value that you would need in that ecosystem. And I think that's one of the things that we're kind of excited about, is that we might be able to bring a bunch of those pieces to the table in terms of a huge ecosystem of students who are either actively looking for a job or who are thinking about what does it take to be successful in the chosen career path that I've made. So I think there's real opportunity there. And, you know, my theory of the case for what it's worth is in the next, you know, 3 to 5 years, the institutions that figure out how to help people make informed choices when they're in the exploratory phase, understand what the pathways are, make that experience of then choosing what you want to do as seamless as possible, and then connect that into work and create, you know, off ramps. Like whoever creates that ecosystem in the most seamless way, I think are going to be the institutions that that win. You know, so.
Yeah, that practical piece is so valuable. You know, I was conducting a focus group about 4 years ago, and I'll never forget, this student said to me, she was in a health sciences program, and she said, you know, I'm graduating senior. I studied in health sciences. I didn't have an internship until the second semester of my junior year. I hated every minute of it, but I am too far down this pathway now, right? I just have to graduate with this degree and be done. The institution was $65,000 a year. She just didn't have the luxury of going back and doing it all over again. So I do think also providing like those applied experiences earlier on, finding a way that students can actually experiment and explore, to your point, is so critical. Because if you're that graduating senior, you know, you don't get a do-over, certainly not at that price point. And you're graduating a student who's going to be highly unsuccessful in their career if they are forced to do that because they hate every minute of it. And you only know that through doing. So I also think schools have to find a way to kind of flip that model and get those applied experiences earlier on.
Yeah, and to your point about being a, you know, a student who showed up at Elon with probably not a lot of social capital and not a clear like support network to help you make those choices. You know, if you're thinking about access and equity and opportunity, these kinds of resources about, hey, this is actually what a career in this field looks like, and here are the different ways, like that stuff can be pretty transformative, because otherwise you're just kind of relying upon who comes to recruit on campus and, you know, what it is that you might be doing on your own to figure out a career path. So we have time for one more question before we wrap. And I guess I'll ask, like, what do you think the biggest misconceptions are when it comes to driving strong student outcomes?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say we have an item that usually gets the most head tilts in our surveys, and that's the question about having a best friend at school. So we often ask that of currently enrolled students at the undergraduate and the graduate level. And sometimes we'll be presenting research and they think, do you really need a best friend? Don't you just need people you can turn to or people you can rely on? all of our research shows no, and you actually need a best friend at school. You need somebody who you can call when you're really struggling with coursework, or you need somebody who's in the trenches with you when you're battling through a group project. You need somebody who can go to and work through a problem. And you need somebody who notices if you don't show up, right? That's one of the biggest things that we see is if you're not in class today, somebody who follows up and says, hey, is everything okay? Because that's actually the person you show up often to study with. So it's the question that we ask that sometimes gets the most criticism from some of my audiences, and we find it's the most powerful to completion. So you have to find a way to help students connect with one another, whether it be through what they uniquely do best through that strengths-based lens or some other type of programming. You have to give students an opportunity to connect with one another. We're inherently relational people. I think the pandemic has really laid that bare, that we have to have a way to connect with other humans if we're going to be productive and engaged. And you have to provide that opportunity to students, and you have to get creative about how you do it.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that because, as you know, we have a team of pedagogical course designers who help, design our offerings in partnership with our, universities, and they have the work they do is grounded in a lot of learning science and decades of pedagogical research, and what we call the learning experience framework is grounded in these three principles: feel, think, and do. And they always say that feel is actually the most important, and feel is about that intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in the sense that of community and connectedness that you feel with your classmates. And in a lot of ways, to your point about you have to get that part right because if you don't, it's not to say that people can't have useful and positive experiences, but that's really the foundation upon which all of these other things are developed. So we're reaching the end, and so I guess for those of you who've listened in for the last 45 minutes, I think you probably understand why Stephanie's always such a joy to spend time with and ask questions to, because inevitably I learned something new and interesting. And Stephanie, I just want to thank you for your partnership and your graciousness with your time always with us. And I do look forward to some of the fun research we can do down the road, and hopefully it will contribute to solving and answering and filling some of the voids out there about how to deliver high quality education in a way that's more accessible and affordable, and create greater access and opportunities. So with that, it's a wrap, and I hope everybody enjoys the warm weather. All right, take care.